Welcome back, everyone, to the Fighting Post. So it looks like Canelo and Crawford are going to be facing each other in September at the Allegiant Stadium. So glad to have you all back on the channel. I'd greatly appreciate it if you could like, comment, and subscribe. I know that Ring Magazine, and for those of you that aren't aware, Ring Magazine was recently acquired by Turki Al-Sheikh in Riyadh season. So a lot of the news that they have coming is essentially a way for Turki to put out information that he would like to put out. But the fact that they're making this announcement kind of legitimizes a bit the discussions that are being held between Crawford and Canelo. I believe that, especially with Canelo, it's never a absolute guarantee until he officially announces it on his own socials. But with the fact that Ring Magazine is the one making this announcement and their connection with Riyadh season in Turkey, I think that we can probably take this information as the truth for now. So my thoughts on this fight. I've already done 2 videos on the specifics of the fight, so I won't get into too much detail when it comes to the particulars. I'm just going to be broadly going over, some of my thoughts, and now that this fight is kind of materializing and being finalized, I'll give my opinion on some of the items that I think that we perhaps haven't considered or are being overlooked by most of the people watching. So when it comes to Canelo Alvarez, it's clear that he's, no longer in his absolute prime. He is on the downslide. But much like many other great fighters of the past, I think that Canelo's B game is still better than a lot of different fighters' A+ game. So Terence Crawford, yes, is not going to be facing a prime Canelo, but he is still going to be facing a Canelo that is, consistently putting on pretty good performances. Whether or not his competition has been the most elite of the elite, doesn't matter. I would say that Canelo has been making fighters that we claim to be ordinary look ordinary. When it comes to Crawford, the same thing. So with Crawford, fighters that he has, faced that weren't the cream of the crop, he's made look like they didn't belong there. But the special thing about Crawford is that even the fighters that we said were going to be a challenge for him ended up looking like ordinary fighters. The best example of that is obviously Errol Spence. But when it comes to this particular matchup, we talk about the weight, we talk about the power, we talk about the boxing IQ and things like that. But when it comes to the weight, yes, there's a clear separation between both fighters. Canelo's the bulkier fighter, and he's going to have a lot more mass on his frame, and he's consistently been working at 168, so it'll be easier for him to manage the weight and the stamina here. When it comes to Crawford, a lot of people are saying that they don't want to see him go up completely to 168. They want to see him kind of maybe stop at 160, 164, and kind of keep his speed and his agility, which I personally think would be the best thing for him to do. When it comes to ways for Crawford to win, I don't see him knocking out Canelo in any kind of fashion. I know it's usually the fast punches and the punches that you don't see are the ones that hurt you, but Canelo's been hit with so many different shots by just about everyone. I don't think Crawford is necessarily going to present something that he hasn't seen. I think that Crawford's best bet, and unfortunately for as big of a fight this is going to be, I think that Crawford's best bet is to make it a boring fight, to make it a fight like what Mayweather did. The only thing, and this has been addressed by so many other people as well, is that Crawford doesn't have the same tendencies. He's not a stick and move kind of guy. He's definitely willing to engage with fighters and is willing to take one and give one. But I think he's smart enough to recognize that in this particular fight, his best bet is to stick and move and to not necessarily over engage with Canelo. And when it comes to Canelo, he's going to obviously need to keep his stamina up. I think probably the sparring partner that he's going to have for this particular camp is going to be Kyron Davis. I think he'll be able to, especially now moving down to 160, I think he'll be able to replicate, and when I say replicate, I don't obviously mean match. It just, try to keep the fighter style in mind. I think Kyron Davis would be able to replicate some of the speed from the smaller weight classes. I also think that Canelo sparring with potentially a Teofimo Lopez, someone who, again, is also from the smaller weight classes, just to deal with the agility of someone that's, that's going to be, moving up. However, obviously neither one of those fighters is going to represent the IQ or the I'd say, or the punching power of Crawford. So he's still going to have to, you know, spar with, you know, guys that are providing those kinds of attributes. But I think that Kyron Davis and Teofimo will probably be good additions for Canelo. Now, Crawford's obviously been sparring with Steve Nelson, and I know that he just lost his fight to Diego Pacheco, but I think it was a competitive fight. Like, it was a fun fight to watch, and I think that'll be a, you know, Canelo's style is a little bit easier to replicate, I would say, in sparring, but the truth of the matter is you're never going to get a fighter that has 100% of the attributes that the opponent that you're going against has. And so I think one of the things that Canelo has that a lot of people just seem to be overlooking is his boxing IQ. I think that we judge him a lot on the losses that he has on his records, but the Mayweather loss, I mean, again, give Mayweather full credit for the fight and all that. Like, he didn't necessarily need to fight an up-and-coming, you know, champion, but Canelo was green. Like, he wasn't necessarily ready for that type of a level, and that is like the biggest level that you could possibly get in boxing. So he was 23, you know, 22, 23, and the fact that some people think that Canelo has had zero improvement since that fight, it leaves me kind of like wondering like what they've been watching the last, you know, few years, decade even. And when it comes to Crawford, it's clear that he's, you know, he's going to be studying Canelo. He's probably been studying Canelo for the last, you know, few months, if not year plus, ever since the fight, you know, began, you know, being discussed about. I know Bernie the Boxer and, you know, Bomac, they're pretty intelligent coaches. For as much shit that like Bernie the Boxer talks, you can definitely tell he like pays attention to the opposition. So like the guy is like super into it. You can tell that he's going to be looking at every single facet of Canelo's like game and try to create something for Crawford that would work in his favor. But something that we see time and time again, and I know what's blinding us with Crawford, like the fact that he's the first like two-time undisputed champion in like 2 different weight classes, and you know, he's great pound for pound and all that. Like, I know why people think that he can be the one to like, you know, knock out or beat Canelo, but on the flip side, like, it's highly improbable. Like, if we're looking at it from a rational perspective, like someone tried to use the example of Manny Pacquiao versus Oscar De La Hoya, but that comparison fell super short. Like, Manny Pacquiao at that point was in the prime of his career. Like, wasn't he around like 30 years old? And on top of that, this was a Oscar De La Hoya that had been fighting at 154, came back down to 147. I believe there might have been a rehydration clause. There probably wasn't, but regardless, like, Oscar De La Hoya had to come down from the weights that he was fighting at. And this was a Oscar De La Hoya that had lost to Floyd Mayweather like a fight before, and or a fight or two before. I believe he fought someone in between Floyd Mayweather and Manny Pacquiao. I can't remember the name right now. But the point is, Oscar was on his way out. So comparing an Oscar that's on his way out to a Canelo that hasn't necessarily been looking super peak, but has been dropping like every single opponent he's faced since Triple G3, I don't think that that's a fair comparison to make. And like, Crawford is great, and skill-wise, he's probably better than like Pacquiao, but he's not greater than Pacquiao. You know what I mean? Like, Pacquiao was a great fighter. Like, Floyd Mayweather was a great fighter. Like, their resumes, like, and again, Crawford wasn't, you know, fighting at the time. You could only face the opposition that, you know, is in your timeline. Like, Mayweather and Pacquiao are all-time greats, and their resumes like make Crawford's look like dog shit. Like, it's not even. And again, this doesn't mean that Crawford wouldn't be able to beat either one of them. He probably would have a good chance beating both of them. But, you know, comparing their legacies to his and their accomplishments and their achievements to his, it's different times, different fighters, you know, different resumes. So it's just not. It's not comparable, honestly, if we're looking at it from like an unbiased like perspective. So, you know, trying to compare it to the Pacquiao and Oscar matchup doesn't make sense. Now, when it comes to Crawford, the other thing that I think gets talked about a lot is his age, but he hasn't necessarily been in the type of wars that would warrant him, you know, necessarily being all broken or like bruised up. Like, we haven't really heard much about Crawford, you know, pulling out of fights due to injuries. Like, it's not something that happens to him a lot. When it comes to, you know, him probably deciding to stay out until September to not really risk losing a payday in this fight against an opponent at 154, 160, or 168, I think that for Crawford, I see it both ways. Like, it could be a bad decision because he's staying relatively inactive versus a Canelo who's probably going to fight a William Skull or a Christian Mbili in May. But also, like, Crawford for the last maybe 5 years has been a one-time-a-year fighter. And so if it's been working consistently for him, I don't see why he should change it necessarily, especially when he's coming into he's coming into the biggest fight of his career. Now, addressing the elephant in the room. Obviously, we all wanted to see Canelo fight Benavidez. It seemed like the more natural, fight to make. Crawford and Canelo wasn't really talked about until Crawford, had beat Errol Spence. And since Errol Spence was kind of in discussions to potentially fight Canelo, it just seemed like a natural course of action for Crawford to take. And I think that at first, when they started discussing the fight, I think Crawford was just kind of like playfully like, you know what, yeah, sure, I'll fight Canelo. Because in interviews before, he was saying Canelo was too big. He doesn't really ever see them fighting. Like, there are too many weight classes apart. But I think that as a competitor, as Crawford started to, really visualize the fight and kind of, see the style that Canelo fights in. Like, Canelo fights in a pretty consistent style. Like, he's coming forward, plotting. Like, occasionally you'll get some head movement. Pretty slow on his feet. I'll give him that criticism. He's coming over, trying to hit your arms, hit your shoulders, hit whatever, biceps, and he's just throwing these big, heavy shots. And he's a less than like a 30 punch per round type fighter now, as to where before he used to be willing and able to throw 5-6 punch combinations. Now he's typically 1, 2, 3 punches at most. So I could see the holes that Crawford sees, but Canelo has said this before, and other opponents have said this before. It's one thing to think you can beat Canelo when you're outside the ring, and it's a completely different animal once you're in the ring. And so I think that once Crawford feels a sliver of the power that Canelo's going to offer, I don't think he's going to go into necessarily like a retreat mode like Charlo did, but I think he's going to be playing too defensively to win the fight. Like, I think the whole catch and shoot thing is going to be, it's not going to work to his favor. Like, there's more money in Canelo consistently fighting and getting a win. And I say that, like, obviously they gave Dimitri Bivol the win, but the scorecards were extremely close. If you guys recall, I think they were like 115, 113. And Dimitri won more than 7 rounds, or at least that's what most people think. And so you're going to have to get a clear, concise win with Canelo, and I don't think that type of a game plan would work on Canelo. He's learned more from the Mayweather fight. We saw that he was able to break down a slick style when he fought Caleb Plant. Not comparing Caleb Plant to Crawford, obviously, but there's little pieces that a fighter can take from his opposition and put that together for his opponent. And I just think that Canelo has seen more styles like Crawford than Crawford has seen like styles like Canelo. But, back to the David Benavidez thing, while this isn't necessarily the fight that we wanted to see, I think that at this point, Canelo doesn't have too many names left. Like, I already mentioned Christian Mbili or William Skull, but like, really, who else is there at 168? Like, you have Diego Pacheco, maybe a rematch with Caleb Plant. If Canelo does decide to go to 175, which I don't think he will, I think he learned his lesson the last time, he's probably not going to get the Bivol rematch. He probably won't fight Beterbiev because, he's 40 years old. The Benavidez fight at this point seems like an impossibility. So there's not really much left for Canelo. And while we all wish that Benavidez fight would have happened, it doesn't seem likely, and we're kind of left with Crawford. And I say left with Crawford in kind of like in a pessimistic way, but realistically, like, it's going to be a big fight at the Allegiant Stadium. I think they hold like something like 65, 80,000 seats. Like, Canelo and Crawford from the nosebleeds are going to look like ants. Like, you're not even going to be able to see it, but I bet you that atmosphere is going to be crazy. I think that this fight, it wasn't necessarily the one that we've been craving or wanting for multiple years, but it's the one that we're getting. Do I think it's going to be another Mayweather-Pacquiao? No, not necessarily. I don't think, you have to remember, Pacquiao was doing 1 million plus pay-per-views on his own. Mayweather was obviously doing 1 million plus pay-per-views on his own. Crawford hasn't even cracked, I don't think, like the 250K mark. And Canelo, he hasn't done over 1 million in quite some time. Now, the only thing that I would say to that is that, you know, Triple G never cracked more than 250 either, and when him and Canelo like matched up, it became like a $1 million+ fight for pay-per-view buys. But that was a Canelo that was in his prime. That was when pay-per-views were a little bit easier to like buy. Streaming wasn't so like prevalent as it is now. And so I don't think that it's gonna do like the pay-per-view numbers of like a Mayweather Pacquiao. I think it might do closer to the numbers of like a Gervonta Ryan Garcia. Hopefully a little bit more. Like, if we're putting two of our best superstars and we want to show that the sport is live and well, I don't think that, you know, like content creators that are like, oh, we're the A side, like, oh, this person doesn't sell any pay-per-views. Like, at the end of the day, we're not the ones getting paid off of it. And honestly, like, I know that sometimes people can be fanboys for certain fighters, but if overall, if our biggest superstars aren't creating or producing the amount of pay-per-views we need them to, it just reflects bad on the sport. So if you're a fan of the sport, you'd want these fighters to succeed. Like, when you can, like, and if the matchup is something you want to watch, you should probably avoid streaming and buy the pay-per-view. Like, I know that sometimes, especially like this Benavidez and Morel card, like, didn't feel like it was worth $80 or whatever. But if we really love the sport and we want to see it grow and thrive, like, we have to also be willing and able to support it. So again, this isn't the fight that we initially wanted or planned to have, but, you know, it's the one that we're getting, and it's going to be an interesting match of styles against two of boxing's current, like, biggest superstars. I still have Canelo winning. I do think it's probably going to be a unanimous decision. Like, Crawford's going to be smart enough to survive. You know, whether or not he's able to take the power of Canelo is going to be one of the more interesting questions. Whether his stamina, and by his stamina I mean Crawford, whether his stamina will be able to keep up for 12 rounds at 168 against a guy who was punching harder than just about anyone and everyone that Crawford's ever faced, will be an interesting question to ask. Whether Canelo can, you know, keep up with the agility and the boxing IQ of one of the, you know, most technically and savvy fighters like we've seen in quite some time, will be an interesting watch. And one more thing, like, I'm a fan of Canelo, I'm a fan of Crawford, but the one thing that I kind of have an issue with is the fact that Canelo was saying that, you know, what does Benavidez bring to the table besides 25 extra pounds? Except Canelo's going to come in like 20, 25 extra pounds heavier than Crawford. And so when it weighs in his favor, like, you know, it is what it is. But when it's his opponent, like, you know, it becomes a problem. So that's the one thing where it's like, all right, like, that's not sitting too well with me, and I don't think that comment necessarily aged too well. And again, like, for those of you that are new to the channel or that have consistently tuned into the channel, I hope you know that this channel is meant to be an unbiased platform where, yes, we're fans of boxers, but we're a fan of the sport before the individual. And at the end of the day, we want to see the matchups, we want to see great fights, and, you know, if we're not necessarily seeing the best fight the best, then what is this all for? Like, it doesn't matter how much fighters are getting paid, none of us are seeing that. It doesn't matter how many pay-per-views are sold at the end of the day, you know, from our perspective, because, you know, we're not pocketing any of the profits. Of course, we should support them, but, you know, more than anything, it's the fights we want to see. And I think that Crawford and Canelo are going to put up, hopefully, a great performance. I'm hoping that it's not like a Mayweather, like, you know, it's not a Mayweather Canelo thing, because that'll just turn off a lot of the casuals that are going to tune in. But Crawford hasn't been in a boring fight yet, so I don't think that that'll be the case. And lately, Canelo's opposition, again, while it hasn't been the best, you know, he's been putting up some entertaining fights. Like the Edgar Berlanga fight surprised a lot of people with its entertainment factor, and I think Crawford is going to enter this fight knowing that he's got to put it all on the line, and I think he'll do that. So with that being said, thank you all again for tuning in. Again, I know I mentioned it in the beginning of the video, but I would really appreciate it if you guys could like, comment, and subscribe. Let me know your thoughts on this fight. Are you looking forward to Canelo and Crawford? It looks like they're going to be fighting in September at the Allegiant Stadium. As more details come, I'll be sure to make more content. But until next time, thank you for tuning in. Peace.